So, today I want to talk about the new climate bill and the cost of making deals with fossil fuel. The US Senate just passed a climate bill known as the Inflation Reduction Act. And while many are celebrating the fact that the US Senate is actually doing something for once, the contents of this bill that was heavily influenced, written by, and inspired by Senator Joe Manchin end up funneling funding and future incentives into the hands of fossil fuel corporations. The more you look into the contents of this bill, the more it reads like the Joe Manchin propaganda bill, all the while doing the absolute bare minimum in terms of actually providing relief for the climate. And truth be told, the media is eating this up and praising Joe Manchin as the great bringer of a climate deal, when him and his corporate donors have been the ones pretty much holding everything up for well over 2 years. So today, I want to spend some time going over a little bit of what this bill entails and going over the harm that it will cause. But before I do, I need to emphasize 2 points. First, this bill was originally supposed to provide over $3.5 trillion and then later $2.2 trillion over the course of 10 years. This has been reduced to approximately $370 billion within that same span of time. The amounts provided here are token at best when it comes to the stuff that is supposed to cause positive change to the environment. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, all of this is being written at a time when extreme weather events are occurring practically weekly. We've had flash floods throughout the United States, with especially devastating flooding in Kentucky in the middle of Appalachia, an area that Joe Manchin should be quite familiar with. We have had aridification of the western United States and droughts throughout the rest of the country. And in addition, we've had massive forest fires, water contamination, and extreme temperatures, as well as numerous other effects of climate change right here on our doorstep. And yet, this is the best that Congress could put out due to the influence and financial backing of the fossil fuel industry. So, with all of that said, let's take a look at what is in Joe Manchin's propaganda bill. So, to start with, when we examine this, I just want to point out the media influence, and this is hardly the only article that's talked about this. It starts off in the New York Times. In a twist of fate, Congress is suddenly poised to pass the most ambitious climate bill in United States history, largely written by a senator from a coal state who became a millionaire from his family coal business and who has taken more campaign cash from the oil and gas industry than any of his colleagues have. Now, they make this sound like it's a good thing, like, oh, he's had a change of heart, a twist of fate has brought this upon us. But if we see someone like this producing a bill, we should be cautious at best and very concerned, truthfully, at the reality of the situation. And the fact is, the Times article here comes on very strong with the propaganda. The fact that this is the most comprehensive or the most ambitious climate bill to date is a very low bar to be stepping over, because, truth be told, it's probably one of the only bills to do so in the US's history. Worse yet, to credit Manchin for the passage of this when he's been the one literally destroying this bill for over 2 years and took it from that original $3.5 trillion package to this pitiful excuse for a bill that we see now, that might have, the original bill might have actually had positive impacts compared to what we're seeing here. It's odd at best and really deceptive at worst. And next, as we go through the article, we find the measure requires the federal government, looking at what's in this bill, the measure requires the federal government to auction off more public lands and waters for oil drilling. It expands tax credits for carbon capture technology that could allow coal or gas burning power plants to keep operating with lower emissions. Mr. Manchin also secured a promise from Democratic leaders to vote on a separate measure to speed up the process of issuing permits for energy infrastructure, potentially smoothing the way for projects like a natural gas pipeline in West Virginia. Now, this paragraph ends up speaking on a lot of what's wrong with this bill, and the article does repeat it quite often. But when we actually look into this and break this down, we find that there's a lot wrong and a lot to this one paragraph. So when we talk about the land being auctioned off, Forbes, of all places, actually had a lot more information about it. It says here that Section 50265 jeopardizes the development of billions of dollars of planned offshore wind projects and renewable power projects on federal land, and it adds to the complexity and uncertainty of obtaining federal environmental permits, even as both Democrats and Republicans proclaim the need to streamline the entitlement process. Under this provision for the next decade after the new law takes effect, no right-of-way could be granted for wind or solar energy development on federal lands unless a quarterly lease sale is held that results in issuance of an oil and gas lease. When we look more into that, we find that, in addition, at least 2 million acres of federal lands must be offered for oil and gas leases in the year before each proposed wind or solar right of the way is issued. Now that's ridiculous and absurd. The fact is that this is supposed to be a bill talking about creating new sustainable technologies in energy and talking about how we're supposed to shift away from the fossil fuel industry. That's the only way to combat climate in all of this. We have to reduce all of our carbon outputs, and we actually have to start making these shifts. Unfortunately, because of the way this bill was worded, at least 2 million acres of land now has to be given to oil and gas companies before anything can go to wind and solar. And that means that at least 20 million acres of federal lands must be offered in total over the course of the 10 years for new oil and gas leases on a quarterly basis. Any interruption or suspension of oil and gas lease sales over the next decade for any reason, including, apparently, if necessary environmental approvals cannot be obtained, if courts block the sales, or if sellers express interest but fail to bid, or if a future administration suspends any oil or gas lease programs, would bring development of all new solar and wind power projects on federal lands to a screeching halt. This bill guarantees that the oil and gas industry gets to continue producing things, that the fossil fuel industries will continue to be sustained over the course of the next 10 years. It doesn't limit them. It doesn't add problems to them. It doesn't make it more difficult. It guarantees them the ability to do this if we ever want to see future technologies developed. Furthermore, it can be for any reason, like I just said. You could have a situation where a court deems locally that, hey, this is really bad for the environment here, and there's no way to not run it through this stream, so we're gonna, side with the protesters and make sure you don't get this land. And because of that, the federal government can then not use similar federal lands for wind and solar projects. Meanwhile, with offshore winds, we're seeing similar risks. Under the proposed law, no lease for offshore wind development could be issued by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in federal waters anytime in the next 10 years, unless at the time of each new lease of an offshore wind area, the organization, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has within the prior 12 months also offered to sell a new oil and gas lease. And if any acceptable bids have been received for any offered tract, issued a lease. In addition, no less than 60 million acres of federal waters on the outer continental shelf must have been offered for oil and gas leases in the prior year, or no new offshore wind leases can be issued. In effect, over 600 million acres of federal waters must be offered, though unsold areas can be reoffered for new oil and gas exploration and production. Failure to maintain the required annual pace of offshore oil and gas leases would block all subsequent offshore wind leases. Now, I think it goes without saying that when it comes to oil and gas production off the shores, that's going to lead to things like oil leaks. That's going to lead towards long-term effects that end up damaging the environment even further while we're seeing climate change happen before our very eyes. And when we go back to the other sections of this paragraph, when it comes to things like carbon capture technology and hydrogen production and all this buzzwords and catchwords that they like to throw out, these really do just represent buzzwords that represent things that a lot of people don't think that it actually is supposed to do. In fact, a lot of environmentalists argue that, for example, carbon capture technology is actually a distraction that's selling us an easy solution that makes us believe that the status quo does not need to be changed. Despite billions being invested in it, it's never really worked out as it's been claimed to. And Senator Manchin is within all of this, claiming that a lot of funding has not been put into it. But in fact, it has never produced a successful outcome, and it's only useful for these companies because they know it's kind of a dead end pathway. Secondly, when it comes to hydrogen, hydrogen may not be the solution that many think it is, especially when it's used, as a lot of these companies are, as a combustible. Because a lot of these companies want to use it as a substitute for other combustible fuels in order to work within plants. And that's really not going to be a solution that works in the long term, especially with its relations to methane gas. Now, as for this pipeline that's mentioned and brought up, I am actually going to be devoting a whole video to it. But the fact that the Times doesn't actually reference it in this particular article and which pipeline they're talking about is a little bit concerning to me, because the pipeline that they're referring to is the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And for now, let me just say that it's something that's been fought against by environmentalists for years, and the pipeline's funders actually have paid Senator Manchin and at least one other senator a relatively lucrative package for their support on this. And it's a little bit funny given that this gets passed with this particular concession in the bill. So, as we go through talking about other aspects of this, we find that a lot of the benefits that are provided all go towards West Virginia. Now, I'm not saying West Virginia doesn't deserve to have good advancements in terms of technology and everything like that. But I think it's a little suspicious that West Virginia is getting the specific support it is to make it look like Joe Manchin is doing just enough for West Virginia in order to keep himself getting reelected. This is a campaign tactic more than it is actual care for the people involved. And now what he's done here is he made a permanent federal trust fund to support coal miners with black lung disease. An actual good thing, especially given that, given the coal industry there and the history there, there is definitely a need for those who have been hurt by corporations and developed black lung to get support. I don't know if that should be government spending for it, because the corporations are the one responsible for doing that to their employees. However, it is still really good to see people who have gone through this and have black lung getting the funding and care that they deserve. And what loopholes they're going to have to jump through in order to get that care, to prove that they in fact have black lung, what doctors they're going to have to visit, that all is still left in the air as far as I know. But that still concerns me on that end, that it's going to be one of those too good to be true type things. Further, it would offer new incentives for companies to build wind and solar farms in areas where coal mines or coal plants have recently closed. And that's an objectively good thing again. But again, I really do think that this is the bare minimum that Joe Manchin could have provided and that his corporate donors could have provided for people in this area, especially when they're doing it all on government funding rather than through private interest. And corporations, as usually, are treating government spending as an externality as a way to cover their externalities and the costs of doing business. Now, a professor at West Virginia University said these are his pet projects. I think he's going to say, I used my strategic position to bring back benefits for West Virginia. And he'll probably do pretty well in the next election. And so that's what this is about. Because if he gets reelected, they know the companies who support him, who pay for him, know flat out that these little gestures will go a long way to getting him reelected. And that means that he'll have that many more years past his next election, I believe in 2024 or 2025, to cause more harm to the environment and to continue producing bills like this one, which will have more long-term negative impacts than positive ones. Now, looking at the bill just a little bit more, and again, there's a lot of repetition in this article going through it, but we have here that many Democrats wanted a clean energy standard that would pay electric utilities to replace coal and gas-fired power plants with renewable power, and that would penalize those that didn't. But Mr. Manchin opposed the measure, so it was scrapped. naturally. Anything that Manchin opposed, he could get his way with because he was able to sink this bill in an instant. And so the power that he represented and the fact that he had his corporate donors backing him in this particular position made it so that we had to kind of accept this. Any progressives in Congress, as well as anybody else, had to accept these bare minimum crumbs in terms of this kind of bill, rather than the whole necessity of what's required to actually meet this climate crisis head on. Further, he vetoed a plan to provide bigger tax credits for consumers who bought union-made electric vehicles, a measure that was opposed by Toyota Motor, which operates a non-union plant in West Virginia. Now, as much as I do not believe that electric vehicles are the solution, I believe, personally, that better public transportation systems, as well as a movement towards walkable cities, will produce better results in the long run. The fact that Manchin couldn't even come to terms with supporting union jobs and electric vehicles is a real big problem. This was a really low bar for him to cross in terms of helping workers and potentially doing something even small for the environment, and he still vetoed it. Meanwhile, of course, it works to protect Toyota's interest in West Virginia, probably protecting the funding of a lot of people who, get their money from lobbies that are tied to and associated with Toyota Motor in this way. And of course, it's a non-union plant, which, is beneficial to these companies. And again, we just constantly see more and more where he's doing just the bare minimum. So he'll now be able to say, well, I helped keep jobs in West Virginia so that the Toyota plant didn't move elsewhere because we protected West Virginian interests and all that. But he's not. And as I'll talk about more in the next video with that pipeline is going to cause significant harm to the environment of West Virginia. And it will clearly show that West Virginia's true interests and the workers' interests is not what he has in mind. Again, he's providing bare minimum incentives to people in order to keep protecting his corporate donors. Meanwhile, we have here that Mr. Manchin has scaled back but did not eliminate a fee imposed on oil and gas operators for leaks of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, from wells, pipelines, and other infrastructure. He rejected an early plan by Democrats to permanently ban oil drilling in the Atlantic and Pacific, and he ensured that long-standing tax breaks for the fossil fuel industry, which many Democrats wanted to repeal, went untouched. So I feel like with all of this, we see the type of incentives he has here. It's to keep the fees as low as possible and, again, do the absolute minimum in terms of saying, well, at least I left the fees there instead of, completely scaling them back. Meanwhile, he kept all the tax breaks and everything else. And between him and the likes of Senator Sinema, we see these kind of moves where Senator Sinema, also to get on this bill, changed the 15% corporate minimum, allowing depreciation deduction used by manufacturing industries that shaved about $55 billion off the total revenue available for this project. And we constantly see this shift where the likes of Manchin and Sinema serve their corporate donors. And as long as you see finances in politics in the way that it is, and corporations constantly able to lobby to the fullest extent to buy politicians and their places, and able to buy key politicians, we will never see them serve the way that people need them to serve, to actually protect things like the climate. And especially when you have actual millionaires like Joe Manchin himself stepping in, who has a vested interest himself in the financial interests of the coal industry in West Virginia. When you have people like that in these positions of power, they will continue to exploit that power for their financial gains and benefit. That's basically where we end up in all of this. And, it's just kind of like a really low blow, a cheap shot here, where Mr. Manchin says that he's satisfied and thinks that we have a balance, he said in a news conference. This is a bill that keeps the fossil industry and keeps the country in a very strong position until cleaner technologies kick in. Now, first of all, this isn't balanced. it's far from balanced. It's completely tilted in the direction of the corporations and the fossil fuel industries. But I think more to the point, the problem is that this bill makes it so that the green technologies will never kick in. The fossil fuel industries can always stop it by just not bidding on certain lands and making sure that other lands are not available for wind and solar production. There is no movement towards renewable energy here, especially as this bill upholds all of the status quo and more of the fossil fuel industry's interests. The fossil fuel industry is currently celebrating this, as they get to keep everything they had and actually gain a little bit more in certain ways, as they now have guarantees that they were not necessarily getting under the early part of the Biden administration. Meanwhile, the environment's suffering, and nobody can do anything about it. This bill does the absolute bare minimum to make Manchin look like a hero and uses buzzwords to make it sound as if he's the solution and he's provided everything that we've been searching for. But I need to remind everyone that Manchin's been the one destroying this very bill and holding up any reform for well over 2 years at this point. We need to recognize that this corporate propaganda bill, this Joe Manchin bill, is what it is, and fight back against it, because otherwise nothing will prevent extreme weather events from getting worse, and the climate will suffer. And if the climate suffers, people will. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord, where we have conversations on political topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.